Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Bacala, the way I read your language of your bill is, if I'm on page 2, line 5, the legislative auditor may access individual level state income tax return data. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
So if this bill becomes law, the legislative auditor will have access to the state returns, income tax returns of every Medicaid applicant in the state of Louisiana?
Yes.
What other tax returns does the legislative auditor have such access to?
The legislative auditor has access to everybody's returns now. What they don't have is the ability to use they can see your return, they can see mine for 41 specific purposes today. So we're not giving them access to records they can't already look at. What we're saying is you can look at them for the purpose of making sure you're eligible for the benefits that you receive.
Why are we putting that extra burden on the people who receive Medicaid, that their tax returns will now be available to the legislative auditor to see whether or not there's compliance with these requirements you're talking about for Medicaid?
I will say again, the auditor can look at those records now. We're allowing the auditor to look at those records to ensure that the people who are receiving the benefit are eligible for the benefit. So if we want to keep people on the records, if we want to keep paying $6,000 a year for people who should not be on the program, then we can keep doing it. This is a mechanism to identify, and it doesn't kick anybody off, Representative. It kicks no one off. It just reports the findings.
I understand that it doesn't kick anyone off, but would you agree with me that the vast amount of Medicaid fraud is committed by providers, not the people who are seeking medical attention?
I think that's true, and I think what I would like to call to your attention, certainly not everything about this program and the committee we sat on, everything isn't contained in this bill. We've already seen some positive movement as a result of that Medicaid task force, including Department of Health making some movement to shore up some of the programs, the providers. As an example, I think they're moving toward centralized mental health provider checklists, because right now mental health providers by and large get licensed via attestation that they meet the requirements. And then every one of the MCOs basically has their own list. So as an example of the task force requirement, now the state is moving toward a centralized list which should help prevent fraud in that program. So this is one aspect. If you're asking me either or, I'll tell you that those things are being addressed internally. This can't be addressed internally by LDH because of statutory prohibitions. We're trying to lift that so that this aspect can be addressed. Another example, single formulary. That was another area of concern. LDH is at least close to making a decision to maybe do that. So this isn't it. This isn't the only piece.
But my question, though, is, if we're acknowledging that if the concern is Medicaid fraud, the vast amount of Medicaid fraud happens is perpetuated by the providers, not by the individuals. Why is it you're bringing this legislation that focuses on the individuals who are seeking medical help through Medicaid, as opposed to going through the providers who may be gaming, manipulating, and defrauding the system? Where's the legislation to deal with providers, as opposed to making the tax returns of those poor people seeking medical attention to bring them under extra scrutiny by the legislative auditor?
Mr. Carter, right now that does not require legislation. We have all the tools in the toolbox to go after provider fraud today. So if we have the tools in the toolbox to go after that, now it's up to the guys, the boots on the ground, to actually do that job. This is one area, Mr. Carter, Representative Carter, where we don't have the tools because it's restricted by law. And it's only restricted as again, we have 41 exemptions already. Everybody can look at tax returns are available. This adds number 42 to a list of 41 exceptions. And the reason this bill is here rather than that doesn't require a bill.
And listen, we've had many conversations when we haven't been you at the well and me on the microphone asking you questions about fraud and abuse in the entire state budget. And no one wants fraud and abuse. Mm-hmm. But I'm strongly against putting additional requirements on those people seeking Medicaid attention. And what your legislation does, it allows the legislative auditor to have access to Medicaid recipients' tax returns, their applications, their tax information. And then what's really troublesome is linked to a revenue measure. If I'm looking at Stephen DeWhite's bill, House Bill 23, on page 34, line 8, your legislation, House Bill 2, that gives the legislative auditor access to the state income tax returns of Medicaid recipients. You've tied these two pieces of legislation together. So in order to have the revenue measures that we need in order to fix the financial cliff, is we must pass legislation that gives the legislative auditor additional rights as it relates to the state income tax returns of Medicaid recipients. This is a bad bill, and I hope that is voted down. Thank you.
Well, I will respond to that last statement by saying this is a great bill. And if we can't ensure that the money that we're spending, $13 million or $13 billion a year